2004. My name is Janet Palmer, and I'm doing an interview with Mr. Robert Rivers, Bob Rivers, and Ms. Elaine Rivers at the Atlanta History Center for the Veterans History Project. Ms. Rivers, would you please state your name and spell your name and give me your birth date?
Elaine Rivers, E-L-A-I-N-E-R-I-V-E-R-S. Date of birth is 5/24/1939.
And Mr. Rivers, would you state your name and spell it and give me your birth date?
Yes, Robert Rivers, but I go by Bob. Rivers, R-I-V-E-R-S. My date of birth is January the 18th, 1934.
Okay. Ms. Rivers, we'll start with you. Can you tell me about what your life was at the time during World War II?
All right. I was born in Atlanta, and we lived in the Brookhaven section. And the biggest impact that it had on me, I knew that my father had to leave home and go to be a soldier because we were having a war. And previous to that time, I was staying at home with my mother, and my father managed a store in Brookhaven called the Variety Store. And he had to leave that work, and my mother had to go to work and take his position as the store manager. And so that put myself having to go to the local nursery school in Brookhaven, and I was very unhappy about it. And my older sister went, she was a year older, and then my baby brother. So we all had to start nursery school. And I remember crying about it and begging to go to the store with her, but I knew what was going on. My father at the time was 35 years old, was wearing bifocals, and had 3 children, and he was drafted. So this had a big impact on the family. He could not see well enough to fight in combat, but he was sent to the Philippine Islands in the city of Manila, and he was put in the Quartermaster Corps, where basically he was checking out uniforms to the soldiers in that area. So I remember my grandmother, who was living in College Park near the Atlanta airport at the time, her house had a central hall which she could close off, and when they called the blackouts, my little brother and I would be staying there some, and she would take us to the central hall of her home and put a quilt on the floor, and I think she had a small lamp in there. And she'd say, now we're going to play a little game. This is so we wouldn't be frightened. And we would all sit down on the floor on the quilt, and she'd say, now I'm going to tell you a story, and we're just going to be really quiet, and we'll play in here for a while, and then later on we'll go to bed. And so that was her way of handling the blackout for small children. And I can remember sitting there. So later, I remember before my dad left, the soldiers had been gathered at the building on Peachtree Road, which was later the Veterans Hospital and the Veterans Administration Building, an old brick red building. And we walked through there and looked through a wire fence, and we could see my father and many other soldiers standing behind that wire fence on Peachtree Road, and some of them were sitting on grass, and I knew he was just about to leave then to be transported out. But I can remember seeing the men in uniforms there. And I remember the day that he came home, and they came to Atlanta's terminal station, which is no more. But I was walking along and holding my mother's hand, I can remember this. And I think it was a cold day, and I had on a little wool coat and a bonnet. And many, many soldiers were getting off the trains down there. And I thought, well, how will we ever find him? And it was my mother and my older sister and myself, as far as I remember. And and then I saw a soldier with 2 women walking toward us. And my thought was, they already have their soldier. And as they got close to us, then I saw it was my father with my grandmother and my aunt, and they were approaching us, and they had picked him up from his train and were coming to meet us there on the grounds of the terminal station. And so that was a happy reunion. And later we took pictures at home, and we still have some of those pictures of his first day back, and he was in his khaki uniform, and we were just so happy to have him back. And then I remember when Franklin Delano Roosevelt died, and he was such a beloved president that everyone loved Roosevelt and everyone cried. And he was in Warm Springs, Georgia when he died, and I think I was in the 2nd grade. And the railroad tracks came right by my school grounds. And we knew that the president's body would be coming past. And they brought all the children outside onto the school grounds. And I remember standing up on a little stone wall out there and watching the train. And everyone just sort of stood in a silent reverence that our president had died. And I remember watching that train go past. Of course, we couldn't see anything but the train, but that was a time when things were done that way, and everyone felt very patriotic and very sad over the president's death. And those are my main memories as a small child of how the Second World War affected me and my family.
Did you have any other relatives, or did you know anybody else?
Well, yes, I had several uncles that went also.
Do you remember getting letters from your father, or getting any correspondence from your father?
Yes, we had letters that he wrote back to us, and I don't know that we still have any of them, but he wrote to his mother, and at one time I had found a portion of a letter that he had written to my grandmother and kept that, and I may still have that somewhere. And I remember at one time he had either sent us or brought home to us a little package of soldiers' rations like they gave them. It seems like it was maybe a metal box and had some little canned things in it.
Do you remember any of the real events of the war?
I only
Harbor, or any of those?
No, I only remember, that he was gone because there was a war, and that when it was over, he came home. And I remember, games we played as children. And I remember a little girlfriend and myself sitting in a front porch swinging and swinging, and we were playing that we were in an airplane. And she would say, "Bombs over Tokyo." And we'd say, "Bombs away." We knew that, planes were dropping bombs, and so this affected children's play during that time.
Where did you get this information?
I think from listening to the adults talk. And I remember my mother and her friends talking about people like Tojo, and I remember they would say that name and kind of laugh, and maybe some of the other ones, but I just heard them talk about it, and none of my uncles were injured, and my father wasn't. And, they were all able to go through the war and come back home, and which was fortunate since, my father was, in a way, he was in harm's way because he was out there in the Pacific, and but he wasn't going to get shot at, really, unless he was bombed in a building out there. So they were all in harm's way when they went out, and I'm sure they probably rode troop ships to the Philippine Islands.
Do you remember anything about rations? Or?
Yes, I remember hearing the talk about them, and I remember, that you couldn't buy meat every day, or we were supposed to have a day or so a week where we didn't eat meat. And one meal that we used to talk about or hear talked about was eating peas and potatoes for a meal. And I remember that there was rationing for gasoline, that my mother said we could only get a certain amount of gasoline every week. And shoes were rationed. I remember that sort of thing, talked about by by the adults around me.
You didn't really feel that, though?
I guess
having
not.
enough food or nothing?
No, I think we had enough to eat, but it was just that, some meals had to be vegetarian, and new shoes were, maybe farther apart. Then I think we had one pair of shoes for every day and one pair of shoes for Sunday, that sort of thing.
Did you have a victory garden, or do you remember anything?
We did. I remember having a victory garden. It was in our backyard in Brookhaven. And we had vegetables planted back there. I remember seeing eggplants growing and that sort of thing. And I remember, and we had some chickens also, which I'm certain wouldn't be allowed now.
I was going to just ask, what was was there much of an adjustment when your dad came back? Did he go back to his same job, or what was that period like as he came home? And how long had he been gone, too?
I believe he was gone about 3 years. And when he came home, then of course my mother was able to come off of her job later, but he did not go back to the same job. But he had previously been in the hardware business, and he wanted to go back into hardware. And I think he went to some courses first. I remember him going to some type of school about hardware, and then he went into a management position in the hardware store in Brookhaven. It was called Brookhaven Supply, where he was there for the rest of his life. And we continued living in Brookhaven. So it was, I don't really remember there being much of an adjustment, except that we had 2 more little sisters after he came back home. So he never talked a lot about it, except he talked about some of the Filipinos, the way they ate, that he said that they would cook a large pot of rice outside, and then they would put fish into it, like sardines or other small fish, and stir them into the big pot. And then the Filipinos would sit around the pot and eat the rice and fish like that, and he never wanted to eat rice again after he came home.
And one other thing I'm interested in is when you were in elementary school, as you were saying, during all of this, in terms of, say, your day-to-day maybe curriculum, or when the war was going on, was it something that was mentioned every day at school, or was it discussed, or did it have an effect on just the day-to-day life of an elementary school child, in terms of discussion or bring it into geography or anything like that?
I don't think we did. I don't think it was brought up to children much. I don't recall it's being brought up in school. Other than that, we would always pledge allegiance to the flag every day, and we knew that we had to stand up and do the pledge for the flag, anything patriotic like that, and we prayed every day in school.
Did you practice the blackout drills or anything like that?
I don't think we ever had to do it during school, because it was generally at night. Mm-hmm. And so it would just involve closing the drapes and turning off all the lights in case, that there were planes coming over Atlanta, which I suppose they thought could have happened back then and didn't. So we were fortunate in that.
How do you feel like the whole experience affected the rest of your life? Do you have?
Well, in a way, I think it did. I think it instilled in the children of that time a certain frugality, that we were taught not to waste food, and to take care of our shoes, and to take care of our toys and our clothes and things of this nature. Of course, I had Scottish ancestors too, and so they were always practicing frugality. So I knew that, people did things to save money, like the women canned food. They would cook tomatoes in the summer and put them up in glass jars to have for next winter, and that sort of thing. So I think it instilled in all of us, a certain sense of economy, that things might not always be the same, and that I think it made us have an appreciation for appreciating the military too, that men had to give up portions of their lives, if not all of it, and go to defend their country, and that patriotism was instilled in children of that era. So that's something that I still appreciate, is military service.
Okay, before we turn to Mr. Rivers, is there anything else that you can think of that you'd like to say?
I don't believe so.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. My name is Sarah Eberhard, and I am continuing the interview with Mr. Bob Rivers. And I'd like to start off by asking what your first memories are of the World War II era, and what triggered those. I mean, if you had any family or close friends that were in the conflict.
Right. Well, let me say that I was 7 when December 7th, 41 occurred, the beginning of the war, and I was 11 when the A-bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And during that time, I was attending Joel Chandler Harris Grammar School, as we used to call it, or elementary school, as they say now, out in West End. And so I have, now I did begin kindergarten actually in 1939, so I was already in school when the Germans invaded Poland in September 1 of 39. I don't remember anything at all about that, nor do I remember anything specifically about Pearl Harbor. The first memory of an actual occurrence during World War II that I have was Doolittle's raid over Tokyo, which I believe was in April of 42, and at that time I was 8 years old. Now, I can remember going out and getting the paper in the morning. It must have been a Sunday morning. We always took the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I remember getting the paper and showing it to my dad, who was very elated. And we had in the paper that morning, we saw aerial photos of the Japanese, of Tokyo, which was being bombed by the B-25s. And I remember that quite well. Some other incidents that I remember actually during the war was the D-Day. My mother had a part-time job down in downtown Atlanta, and she would go in on Saturday, and I had gone in with her that morning, and I remember as we sat there, it was in the Rhodes Haverty building, I remember that, and I remember, I guess I was old enough at that time, I was 10, so I was able to read the paper and look at the pictures, and saw the big headline about the Allies landing at Normandy, and I was quite thrilled about that. I also remember, I guess, in late 44 when MacArthur landed back in the Philippines, fulfilling his promise to return. And then I can also remember, of course, VE Day and VJ Day. I remember when the bomb was dropped and nobody really knew what it was at the time. And so those are my memories of actual events during World War II. I also remember when Roosevelt died and how sad all the neighbors were, the adults as well as the kids. And so those are some things that I remember actually happening. Another thing I remember is, I guess, as Patton's army drove across Europe after D-Day, I can remember seeing the newspapers, and they always had these battle lines, and it showed the battle lines constantly moving eastward toward Berlin. And I can remember following that and being real excited that the Allies were moving on into the Reich, and maybe the war would soon be over. Now, my dad was not in very good health. He always said he was too young for the First World War and too old for the Second one, and he was not in real good health, and I'm sure he was classified as a 4F, so my daddy never went to serve, but my mother's youngest brother, my Uncle James, was a career Army man. I think he went in probably, I'm not sure of this, but I think he probably went in before Pearl Harbor. He was probably in his late 20s at that time, and served, well, actually throughout the war, and retired from the Army as a Master Sergeant. His time, though, he was not in combat, but he was in the Persian Gulf Command. He was stationed in present-day Iran, and they were helping supply oil to the Russians for the Russian or the Eastern Front. And I can remember getting Iranian money back that he would send to me in letters to my mom. And he would also occasionally write a letter to me. And I remember the V-mail, the lightweight air mail that letters would come in. One of my favorite mementos of World War II was when my Uncle James was either going to or coming back from Iran. He was on a troop ship that landed in Italy, Naples, I believe, to be exact. And at one time, I had a ring that he had sent me. It had Mount Vesuvius on the ring. And I also remember one of my most prized possessions was a German helmet that he had traded for or somehow got a hold of. And my little buddies and I, there in West End, out on Stokes Avenue, we had more fun playing with that German helmet. And I wish I still had it, but I don't know. My mother was kind of a neatnik, and she probably threw it away at some point. I don't know whatever happened to the German helmet. But we had a lot of fun playing with it, as well as mini balls that we dug up from the Battle of Ezra Church, which was the Civil War battle that was fought out in southwest Atlanta. So my little buddy and I, Leroy, that lived next door, we would dig up mini balls, and we would play war. I also have another story that is real fun. My mother decided, I guess in about 42 or 43, sometime during the war, that she wanted me to play the piano. So they ordered me a very nice piano that was in a large wooden crate. And I took piano, I guess, for a couple of years, but I was not much interested in piano. But I had more fun playing with a crate than I ever did with a piano. That crate during World War II was out in our backyard, and that crate became a submarine, a tank, a fort, and I want you to know we killed more Japs, and that's what we called them back during World War II. I know that's probably not correct to express it that way, but you know, we were pretty much propagandized, and so they were little Japs, and of course the Germans, and we just killed them by the droves out in my backyard, because that was what we did. We played war pretty much all the time. Well, I guess we played cowboys and Indians a little bit, but we played war most of the time. One of the stories that I remember about a neighbor that we had, this lady, very nice lady, she commented to my mom one time as I was running around shooting machine gun bullets and throwing hand grenades, imaginary, of course. She speculated she wondered aloud to my mom, she said, how in the world does he make noises like that? Coming out of this little 8 to 10-year-old boy. And so we had a lot of fun playing war. And my little buddy next door, Leroy, and I remember that we had like a walkie-talkie situation rigged up over our driveway from our window in our dining room to his bedroom. And we could tap out Morse code on this. And we both learned the Morse code because that's what was, I think that's the troops used that. And so we both learned the Morse code, and we also had something called the Aircraft Spotters Handbook. And it was a book that had all of the Allied airplanes in there, the German, the Japanese, the Italian airplanes, and it would show different views of these aircraft, so that if a Mitsubishi, for example, had flown over Stokes Avenue, me or Leroy would have been able to identify it. You know, we knew all the airplanes, not only U.S. and British, but also for the Axis powers too. And so we were quite into the war effort. Now Leroy he was the baby of the family. He had 3 older brothers who were all in the service, and he also had an older sister. I remember Norman was an Army lieutenant. Jack was a side gunner on a B-17, I believe, that flew combat missions over Germany. And R.B., who was the youngest of those 3, he was in the Merchant Marine. And I can remember them coming home after the war and us being in total awe of all of these boys. Now, the only thing about it, these boys always coached Leroy. When Leroy and I would get into little fights, we were inseparable when we were kids. His brothers would always give him tips on how to beat me. And so Leroy always had an advantage. I was an only child. And so Leroy always could handle me pretty well. Now, I remember another thing. My wife mentioned the blackout drills. We had them on Stokes Avenue, which is where I live. 4 houses up from where I lived, Mr. Wire was our, I guess, block warden. And Mr. Wire let Leroy and I become his assistants. And what a thrill that was. You know, you can imagine a 9 or 10-year-old boy being given a flashlight, and I don't think we had helmets, but we could accompany Mr. Wire when he went up and down the street. And if we saw a light, we would have to go to the door and tell people to cover that light. And you know, I've often wondered to this day exactly what we thought was going to attack Atlanta, Georgia. Now, I could understand it, say in Savannah or Charleston or somewhere like that, because we did have submarines right off the coast. And, you know, they say in those port cities that you could actually see burning U.S. freighters right off the coast that had been torpedoed by German submarines. But how in the world they thought these planes were going to get over Atlanta, I don't know. Maybe it was a psychological thing that they wanted everybody to really get in the spirit of things. And I can remember being, I guess when I wasn't on duty with Mr. Wire, I can remember, like my wife does, having an interior hallway that we would get into, and by flashlight we would read comic books. Now, I remember the comic books of that era. Superman, Captain Marvel, people like that, they were always fighting the Nazis or the Japanese, you know. And and I can remember during school time, all the kids drew pictures of fighter planes and tanks, and I mean, we just drew constantly. And it was all war-oriented. And like my wife, I can remember, of course, pledging allegiance to the flag, saying prayers. And another thing I remember is Kate Smith.
Yes.
Saying, God bless America. And I get kind of emotional thinking about it.
But this was at school.
Oh, yeah.
Over the speakers every day.
Yeah. And, we were just patriotic as we could be. And so those are some memories I have. And
it really, for both of you, it sounds like it was because of the ages that you were that it was almost the norm as you grew up. Like you're saying, your very first formative memories are all war related. Was it different? Was it much of a lifestyle change as you came out of it and went through and everything settled back, and because that's all you had ever known.
Well, a couple of things that I remember, and I forgot to mention, was that I remember the meatless Tuesdays we used to have, and I can remember that my dad and mom, of course, nobody took a vacation during the war. I don't remember ever going on a vacation. I guess I was too young before the war. I think they did take me to Florida one time back in the maybe late 30s, but I really don't remember that. And the first vacation I really remember was in 1947, because people did not travel. You couldn't go by car. We had an old 1938 Plymouth that my dad inherited from his dad, who passed away about that time, and we drove that old 38 Plymouth from that time on until 1949, when we bought a 1949 Ford. And that 38 Plymouth, my mother used to say we pushed that car all over West End, because nobody could afford to buy a new car. I remember quite well the rationing stickers on the front window. And another memory I have, my dad would take us out to eat. I guess this was during World War II, and we would go down to downtown Atlanta. This was prior to shopping centers and all that kind of thing, and there was an S&W cafeteria in downtown Atlanta, right on Peachtree Street, and I think it was probably one night when we went and ate down there that I guess they had a war bond drive, because they had a captured Japanese mini submarine that was on display right there in the middle of the street. And I can remember as a kid, I guess my daddy lifted me up, and you could look through the porthole or some place that they had cut in the Japanese submarine, and you could actually look in and see the Japanese characters written on the controls and all of that. And I'm sure they were selling war bonds during that show. And so I remember seeing that, and that was, that was a big memory for a kid to see a Japanese submarine. That was really something.
Similar to what you just mentioned, around the city of Atlanta, are there any specific events that you remember, or just in relating to the city of Atlanta, in terms of how Atlanta as a city reacted to the war effort?
Well, let me say this. I just thought of another thing. My daddy used to take me out to Ponce de Leon ballpark back during the war years. I guess I was 10 when when he decided I was old enough to take to see the old Atlanta Crackers play. And we would ride the streetcar. Atlanta had streetcars back then, and you have to be my age or so to remember the streetcars. But we would ride out to Ponce de Leon ballpark, and to me it was such a thrill to see. To me, they were like major leaguers, but they were not. It was minor league baseball. And my daddy, who had grown up in the 20s and was a longtime baseball fan, he always put down the teams in 1944 and 45. He would call it wartime baseball, because most of the really able-bodied young men were off in the service, and so they had a lot of 16, 17-year-old boys playing professional ball, or guys who were in their 40s who were too old to fight, or they had a bunch of Cubans that would come up. They had a lot of Cuban ball players. I can still remember the names of some of them. And they would, to me, it was great baseball, but Daddy would always shake his head and say, this is wartime baseball, because they would make a lot of errors. They weren't as good as the players would have been back in the 30s, and Daddy always put that down. And of course, Daddy was a sports fan. He would always take me to Georgia Tech football games. He was a graduate of Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech, and I have to tell a little bit about Tech in Georgia then, because Georgia Tech, back in 43, 44, along during the war, they had what they called the V-12 program, and that was where they took these young men who were training to be naval officers or naval pilots, and they would, while they were completing their studies, they could play football. So they had these bunch of young studs, and they were playing Georgia, for example, who really didn't have a program, and a lot of Georgia players were 4Fs, and Tech would just beat Georgia like a drum back then, and to this day, Georgia doesn't count the results of those war years because they felt like Tech had an unfair advantage. So I cut my teeth on Georgia Tech football and Atlanta Cracker baseball. And then, of course, after the war, the veterans started coming back, and I'm sure my daddy thought the quality of play had improved quite a bit.
Now, as the war years ended and you continued on through school, and I know you were in the service later on, tell a little bit about how this has continued to obviously affect you throughout your life. Did this affect you going into the service? And I know you're a member of some organizations now. Just tell a little bit about how it's continued to, as time has gone on.
Well, it made quite an impression on me because I have always been a buff of World War II especially, and I certainly go along with Tom Brokaw, who calls that the greatest generation. I have, my uncle served, my daddy didn't serve because of his health and age. However, I just have a tremendous admiration for men who served during that time. I've had the pleasure during my life of meeting a number of people who were combat pilots or flew bombing missions or were actually captured by, I've known two men that were captured by the Germans in both cases and spent time in prison camps. And I just make it a point to, go up and shake their hand because I just think, now my service back in the 50s, there was really very little going on, and I am absolutely not a hero. But I do know I was on flying status and flew in aircraft similar to some of the bombers in World War II. And I often thought when I was serving my time, what if somebody had been shooting at me? I said, you just always wonder if you could have done as well as those men that were flying combat missions in World War II. I never felt like I had any really good war stories at all, but I have the utmost admiration for those men that served back then. And being such a buff and fan of World War II, my two sons, I've made sure they got to see every movie like Patton and Midway and all of that, and made them have an appreciation for that. And as a result, both of them are they're really buffs of World War II now, because I would, kind of indoctrinate them on that.
And now, in your service, was that following your graduation from high school that you went into the Air Force?
No, I went on into college and was in ROTC, both in high school and college. And then when I graduated from college ROTC, I got my second lieutenant's bars. And I went to navigator training and served a year learning to be a navigator, and then flew for 2 years on a aerial refueler, which was similar to the B-29, except the bomb bays had been taken out and they had put JP-4 jet fuel tanks, and we used to do mid-air refueling. And I used many of the same, this was in the mid-50s, and we used a lot of the same navigation equipment that was used in World War II. In fact, the environment that I flew in was more like World War II than what it would be now to be flying compared to the mid-50s.
Now, where were you based during your active?
Well, all of my bases were in the continental U.S. I went to flight school in Texas, and I was stationed at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, and also stationed at Warner Robins Air Force Base south of Macon. So, but we flew all around practice missions all over the country and down in the Caribbean, generally speaking. But it made me, I tell you what, it made me have an appreciation, for what some of those navigators and pilots went through flying bombing missions over Germany. I mean, it gave me a little inkling, I'll put it that way.
Did you cross paths with any World War II veterans during your time? Were there?
Yeah, there was a aircraft commander that I flew with a few times who had, I think, went to Canada and joined the RCAF actually before America got in the war. He was an old grizzled veteran. Yeah, sure was.
Do you remember when the servicemen started coming home? Were there festivities and parades or anything like that?
Not too much, really. I guess I remember the stories about a lot of the older students. In fact, we might have even had some at my high school that maybe had their high school. I think we had some older boys that had maybe been in the service during World War II. But I was just entering the 8th grade when the war ended, so and I guess, and I was in a junior high school situation, but I think by 47, when I started the high school, I think I remember maybe some older kids that came back who had actually been in the Army or the Navy or what have you.
Were your parents or your father, you didn't say what he did, was he involved with the war effort?
No, not at all.
History?
Not at all. No, he was an accountant, and he worked for the state Georgia Highway Department, and he also worked for a private construction company. But he was very supportive. I know that when long after my father had passed away, eventually I inherited some bonds that he had bought way back in the 40s, war bonds. He bought a lot of war bonds, I know, back in the 40s. And those bonds wound up being passed on to me. Yeah, and boy, it was kind of like looking back and seeing those bonds in 1943 and 44,
Talk about frugality.
Yeah, and my daddy was very conservative. His big experience, I guess, was the Depression. He used to tell me a lot about the Depression and so forth. And but he was supportive, of course, of the war effort, but he was not in good health.
I know you mentioned following on and this could be for both of you, following the like the troop progression in the papers. But what about what role did the radio play? Did you listen to the radio every night for updates or certain times, or were there special programs you would make a point of listening to?
The main thing I remember is the Bob. I remember radio quite well. I don't know that we don't really remember listening to war news all that much. I'm sure I did. I remember a lot of the shows they used to have in the afternoon that were for kids, like Jack Armstrong and what was the one, Froggy the Gremlin?
I always listened to the Buster Brown show.
Buster Brown show, kid things.
I think the Buster Brown show was on Saturday morning, so that was a radio show for kids.
There was one called Let's Pretend.
And so
that?
we always listened to the radio.
Yeah.
I think it was, we would hear patriotic songs like Kate Smith singing and that kind of thing. And
yeah, I cracked up when I said Kate Smith, because every time I think of her singing that, it breaks me up.
And in the going to the movies at the theater, I'm sure you mentioned how into the war you were. Did you really look forward to seeing some of those shorts before the movie started that would show you some real visual updates on the war? Or?
I remember the movie-tone news, movie-tone news, and I guess there was so much, and some of these films that Hollywood made were even after the war, where they always pictured the Japanese as always buck teeth, and always, when they got shot and killed, they would scream, like a bunch of big sissies or something, and we were sort of propagandized, no question about it, but I think it was justified. I think it was totally justified.
This is a continuation of the interview with Mr. and Ms. Rivers. Are there any other memories that you have that you'd like to continue speaking about?
I just remembered something else that we did at school, that we would have scrap metal drives, and everyone was supposed to collect the tin cans from home that you had opened and had vegetables from, and they would have the labels peeled off, and they would stamp them down flat, and these flat tin cans were turned in at the school so that they could be used in, I suppose it was government or industrial use. I'm not really sure what they went for, but any kind of scrap metal like that was recycled back then and reused. And the paper drives too, and the old newspapers would be saved and turned in at schools.
And also, we collected grease, because I understand, people back then cooked with bacon grease. A lot of us did, at least down south. And we would go around and have grease drives, because as I understand it, they used this somehow or another to make munitions.
Was there anything else? No.
I think that's pretty much it.
Are you involved with any organizations, veterans organizations, or World War II type organizations, military?
Well, I am very involved in United Daughters of the Confederacy, which is an organization for women, of course, who are descended from Confederate soldiers. And I had at least 3 great-great-grandfathers who fought for the Confederacy. And that's another military line for in your family genealogy. And so I'm very interested in that organization, and one thing that we do is to honor veterans of all wars. And we find the graves of Confederate soldiers, and we mark those graves as Confederate soldiers and dedicate them and hold ceremonies for them. And we often give crosses of military service to servicemen like my father, or anyone who has been in the military in any of the American wars, and who is also descended from a Confederate soldier. So we often give these medals. Quite a few are given every year, and honor our servicemen who are still living, or I can still have one issued posthumously for my father because he served in World War II. So this is something I think that World War II helped to teach a lot of us, that to appreciate patriotism for veterans of all wars.
I'm in a similar organization. We're the, brother organization to the United Daughters of the Confederacy. We're the Sons of Confederate Veterans, or more popularly known as the SCV. I had a great-grandfather, John Rivers, who fought as a 17 to 18-year-old for the Confederacy as Sherman's Army came down into Georgia. And so I'm a direct descendant of John Rivers, and I also had some uncles in the Graves line who fought, and some were killed during the war between the states. And so Elaine and I both are very supportive of Southern heritage, and also I would like to get the word out to say my fellow members of my graduating class from Brown High School of 1951. They would be, of course, my age, and many of them would have good memories of World War II and their relatives, parents or brothers or what have you. And I hope to get the word out so that some of them can come down and do what Elaine and I have done today.
And you've got some pictures that we'd like to take a look at.
See, I have a picture of my father here. His name was Marion King Puckett, and like I said, he was in the Quartermaster Corps in World War II and was stationed in the Philippine Islands. And he gave about 3 years out of his life away from his family and business to serve his country. And men quite often had their pictures made in their uniforms during that time. And then this is another picture of my father and mother where he is in his service uniform again. And I think all the men were proud of their service uniforms at that time and were very patriotic. And then I have another picture that was taken on the day that he came back home, and this is a picture of my father in his khakis standing with his own mother. Her name was Antoinette Hughes Puckett, and she lived to be 104 years old, so she far outlived her son. And she died in 1986. But I think it was a sign of the times that everyone was proud of their military service and of their uniforms and what it stood for and what they gave up, the sacrifices that everyone made during that time.
Thank you. Mr. Rivers?
Yes, this is my uncle James A. Graves. He was a career Army man. You can see from the patches that he was a master sergeant when he retired. He served during the entire 4 years of World War II in the Persian Gulf Command. And although he didn't see any combat, he was still, like my wife said, in harm's way. I think anybody that was in at that time was. Also have a few other pictures here. Hope you can see it here. The top photo shows the training company or platoon that my uncle was in. And the other two photos, the middle one there shows my uncle in the middle having a bite to eat with some of his Army buddies. And the bottom one shows my uncle on the left, as you look at it, with some Iranian kids that they befriended while they were over in Iran back in the war years. I have another one that I wanted to show. This is to show the patriotism that imbued the youngsters. This is me on your right down here, and my little buddy Leroy. We had our sailor hats on. We were very proudly given a pretty good salute, I think, you know. And so we always were with our sailor caps or aviation goggles or something like that. And so that just shows the patriotism that the kids felt.
Thank you very much.
Oh, we enjoyed that.
I want to see your pictures a little more close up. Those